So let's talk about array properties, indexes, and elements. Now, in the last video, we created this constant with our 3 drinks inside. Now, you may have heard from a terminology perspective, what are these items inside our array called? Now, in fact, these are called elements. So whenever we add something to an array, we're adding an element to an array. Now, don't get this confused with DOM elements, perhaps an HTML element. Elements inside an array are simply referred to as their being. So whether it's a string, it's an element. Whether it's an object, it's an element. It's just terminology to refer to something inside of that array. So what I want to demonstrate are how we can access array elements by using the index lookups. Now, as we know, just like objects, we can use a square bracket, and we can understand this further by if we expand this. So even though our array looks like a square bracket list, it's in fact indexed in order in the same way that strings also are. So we have this zero-based index, which we should be used to by now, and we can pass in something like 0, and this will give us lemonade. We can save this out, and you can see that we can swap these over and switch between which array indexes we want. Now, typically you'd pass this in dynamically. Perhaps you've clicked on something in the browser and you've chosen list item number 3, and we get given back perhaps a number from that click, and we pass it in and go and access an item. So this is typically what we would use this for. Now, similar to using 0, we also mentioned a few times during this course that we can also use string numbers because JavaScript converts that number to a string regardless. However, as I've mentioned, my and many other personal approaches are to stick with the number format over a string. So we now know how to access the first item in the array, but what about if we want to access the last item in the array? Now, to understand how we might do this, we can inspect our array again. Now, I don't know about you, but I've noticed that we have this length property. And if we go ahead and remove Peach, for example, our length will then decrease to 2. Now, the dev tools have made this quite nice for us. You see this 2 here. This is actually reflective of the array length, so we can see it without expanding it. So we know that there are 3 items in this array. That is the length. Now, it's quite strange because you say there's 3 items, so we have 1, 2, 3, but their indexes are 0, 1, and 2. So be careful not to just say, oh, it's a 3rd item, so we must put a number 3 in as an example, because that's not going to give us anything because that item doesn't exist in the array. So back to where we were, what we want to do is use our drinks.length to essentially pass in the number 3 to our lookup. But as we've just learned, we need to minus 1 because there are 0, 1, and 2 items in the array. So we'll save this out, and you can see that we have successfully asked for the last item in the array. And we could go ahead and remove this one, save it out, and we'll always get that last item in our array. Similarly, we could go ahead and add some more items. So it's kind of dynamic now. We don't need to keep working out and trying to see how many items there are. We can just use that length property to our advantage and access the last item at any time. Now, it might be that we somehow want to access an item and then also replace the value perhaps. So let's say lemonade, we decided to create a diet lemonade version. Using our exact index, we can then override that value. And because we're logging it out here, you can see that our change has now been reflected in the console. Now, something more interesting is we can in fact use strings, as we know, because this number is technically being converted to a string. We can use strings to set values in our array using words instead of numbers. So we could, for example, have our favorite drink, which we'll say is cola. If we go underneath, console log out our drinks array, we'll see something quite interesting. Now, arrays are objects, but they're a special type of object, and we can confirm this by using type of array. And you can see that gives us object. So an array is an object, it has properties. We know it has properties because of 0, 1, and 2. And this is just the way that we would access them. Now, alongside 0, 1, and 2, we also have this favorite property, which we've just added via here. So you can add items to the array like so, but it's typical that we would use a numeric based approach because again, this almost looks like an object and it might seem that we would like to use an object, but it's good to know that it is in fact possible. One other thing that I want to show you is how we can reset or empty an array. Now we could go ahead and say drinks equals new array, but we're using a constant, which means we can't reassign the value. And this is probably a good thing because this is introducing reassignment, which can lead to errors. So let's just log this out for example, and we have a brand new array here. Now to avoid this approach, what we'd like to do is keep our constant because we want to maintain a more predictable code base. So instead of resetting our array, we'd say drinks.length equals 0. Now when we save this out, you can then see that we have an array and it still keeps this property on it. And this is another reason why we should avoid doing something like this, but it's good to know, as I mentioned, that it is completely possible. So by resetting this length property, it clears out all the items in our array and we can start afresh if we need to. Now we could also use another approach. We could say drinks, and we haven't looked at this, but for completeness, we can use a splice method and then pass in the drinks.length. And what the splice method does is removes elements from the array. So we basically tell it to start at the front of the array, 0, and then we say remove as many items as there are in the length. So using splice is a nice way to do things, or alternatively, we can go ahead and use the length property. Personally, I would use the .length. It's clear, it's easy. We don't have to digest the splice and 0 and the drinks length property as well. So that's it for this video. We've discussed array indexes, the properties, and also these things which we call elements. We then looked at how to access any kind of element using its index. We looked at accessing the last element. We looked at adding custom properties to our array, and they're not very common in a use case perspective. And we also looked at two different methods to clear our array out and reset it by keeping our constant happy and not reassigning values and causing unexpected potential reference errors.